Greetings, salutations. Last week, we discussed the gender role egalitarian nature of the early church, and this week, we will be looking at the time period immediately following that, which is the Romanization of the church with the adoption under Constantine, as well as how that perpetuated into the Middle Ages. So, starting off, many of us are familiar with the roles of medieval women and how they were portrayed by the church at the time. Women were homemakers, temptresses, prone to evil, lacking in intelligence, and fundamentally flawed by their nature. This itself begs the question, what changed? How did we get from the early church to here? My proposition for the answer is that 312 AD happened. Now, what happened at 312 AD? Well, that is where Constantine makes his promise to convert to Christianity and begins the process of the Roman Empire adopting Christianity as its majority religion. So, during the reign of Constantine, Christianity was legalized, institutionalized, but this didn't necessarily change the culture of Rome that we explored last week. And as the emperor was shifting to Christianity, it became politically advantageous for various politicians, governors, or anyone wanting any form of political office to convert as well. That is, conversion for political gain. Now, this is a rather large subject, and I could spend many weeks on the Romanization of the church. As we're focused on women's roles, we're going to limit our discussion to that. So, it is during this period of Romanization and into the Middle Ages that the cultural idea of a woman being unequal and underneath a man was being institutionalized. The two fundamental changes we will look at from early doctrine are the sins of Eve and the ideals of Mary. Let's start with the sins of Eve. Though I'll note before we start getting in too deep, there's going to be assumptions as to what the motives were for this switch. We don't know what the motives were, so we are left to speculate. Any writings that originate from this time tend to actually focus more on the Arian tradition and the Trinitarian, non-Trinitarian disputes that were ongoing, rather than focusing on the roles of women. But, that said, let's go ahead and dive in. During the assimilation of Christianity into the Roman culture, a religious reason was sought to justify the culture. That is, an excuse not to change the established political order. Eve was the recipient of the brunt of this explanation. In religious art and theological dissertations, she was used as the example of sin, making the two synonymous. Scripture discussing Eve's sin were emphasized and used to posit that women were, by nature, temptresses and prone to evil. One of the verses specifically they used, and actually the one we discussed last week, was 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. If you are looking for us to expound upon that verse, I would recommend watching last week's episode, as we will be skipping over that this week in interest of time. Instead, this week, we will be looking at and rebuking the perception of another biblical woman who received a similar treatment to Eve, that is Bathsheba. Her story is related in 1 Samuel, chapters 11 and 12, and we won't read the entire chapters here and now. Instead, we will just summarize the story. David sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof or through a window. The text isn't 100% clear. He summons her to the palace, proceeds to impregnate her, then has her husband killed so she may marry him. David is then rebuked by God via the prophet Nathan. What's been posited historically is that her bathing on the roof was an attempt to flaunt her beauty and to tempt those around her, or specifically to tempt David. Now, King David, being a man after God's own heart, is then portrayed as not being one who is prone to sin, and, well, he had to be tempted by the woman, thus she would be at fault. Put bluntly, that's not supported by the scripture. First, we must understand that this story in Samuel is part of the story of David's life. As such, Bathsheba is not cited directly as to what her motives or agreement. Was this rape? Possibly. Was she a willing participant? Possible. Was she a resistant but willing participant, seeing that she was unable to resist the authority of the king? I would lump that under rape, but it is kept separate in theological discussions. But again, we don't know. The author here is telling us David's story, and as such, there aren't that many details regarding Bathsheba. At the time, in the medieval and Roman traditions, this is almost used as a Old Testament but more modern representation of the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam, in their view, would not be prone to sin, and Eve was forced to tempt him to sin. But I digress. First, we want to get a look at the cultural understanding of this passage. That is, that bathing on the roof, or even if it were bathing in public, would have been the norm. They did not have the same privacy available to them that even the Middle Ages was able to afford their citizens, though, again, as you go up the social ladder, more and more privacy was afforded. But we have no reason to believe that she was part of the nobility. So an understanding of the bath being necessarily a method to tempt or an abnormal use of bathing is not supported by the scripture and culturally can be rebuked. Now, when we see that David is rebuked by Nathan, he does call out Uriah as an innocent man. However, the prophecy is about David, and again, we see that it is empty of any qualifying terms. It does not speak anything to Bathsheba good, or more importantly for our point today, it does not condemn Bathsheba. Again, as this is a message to David, it makes sense that it is ignoring her role or lack thereof in the affair. So, in short, her activity was not the problem of this chapter. Instead, it's David's sin at the forefront, and the negativity that was applied to Bathsheba in this passage is unsupported. Let's move on now to the ideals of Mary. Now, in case there is any confusion, we're specifically talking about the veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus. If Eve in the medieval and Roman mindset was the embodiment of an evil, sinful nature, Mary was the embodiment of good. To start with, she was portrayed as a member of the nobility, later sainthood as that moved into fashion to appoint saints. But initially, she's a member of the aristocracy. She is the queen mother of King Jesus. She was also portrayed as a virgin. This, when coupled with the inaccurate view that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, this was used by the church to reinforce that the sexual act was degrading, and that because women were, as their view went, a solely sexual vessel, they were to be excluded from the ministry entirely. It is roughly about this time that clergy were instructed to strive to be celibate, and later on would be required to be celibate, so that they might avoid the temptresses. As a short commentary on this view, it too is unsupported by scripture. Jesus is noted as having siblings, and so of their family, Jesus is the only one who had a virgin birth. I'll allow you to connect the dots and conclude that Mary did not remain a virgin. Within the Old Testament, the book of Song of Solomon itself is a celebratory, sensual love poem, and I submit that as evidence that the physical sensual is not perceived in the Bible as inherently evil. And as for the view on Mary Magdalene, that itself comes from conflating the unnamed sinner in Luke 7 with Mary Magdalene. Additionally, this conflation only appears in the period church writings and is understood to have originated then rather than have been a written down oral tradition, as the earlier writers ignore that. I should put a note in here, the idea that Mary Magdalene was the wife of Jesus originated at around the same time or later. These were two conflating theories that ended up being used by the Catholic Church and a sect of heretics to argue about the role of women and how Christianity should be moving forward. Moving to conclusion. I believe we've shown here in our discussions that the roles and views that were held during the late Roman period and the Middle Ages regarding women were unsupported by Scripture, and they have their roots in maintaining the existing power structure that was in place at the time. There are other portions in this time frame that honestly would make for some good lessons. We could explore the other segments of how the church evolved from a persecuted religious movement into the political juggernaut it became, and I would encourage you to go down those studies in your own time, as that helps shed more light on our argument. However, alas, we do not have infinite time, so we're going to have to settle for the scope we limited ourselves to today. So that said, have a blessed day, and a Jesus-filled week, everybody. Take care.